Today's podcast is sponsored by the guys in the flag jackets. Gary and Jim are the guys in the flag jackets. Every week, these two sit down and discuss a wide variety of political issues, all the way from the weird and wonderful world of local politics to more obscure political ideas and concepts. Ever wondered about the 1979 Chicago mayoral election? Well, I hadn't either until these guys came along and blew my mind. Or did you know that the layout of the ballot can have a crazy influence upon the way you vote? Neither did I, but thankfully Gary and Jim were there to tell me all about it. So if you want a fun and intriguing look into US politics from a unique perspective, check out the Guys in the Flag Jackets podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find the link in the description below. I have to admit, I used to be a little bit of a book snob. I wouldn't even consider a Kindle, let alone an audiobook. It just felt like cheating. But that is until I tried Audible and Open Audible. Ever wonder where I find the time to read all the books that my guests have written on this show? Well, this is the answer. When I'm behind in my reading, I just jump to audiobook. Open Audible is a cross-platform audiobook manager designed for Audible users that can allow you to download, view, manage, and connect your favorite audiobooks on MP3 so that you can enjoy them across all your devices. Best of all, you can control it all from a desktop application. I'm giving away a copy of Open Audible for the entire month of November. All you have to do is sign up to my mailing list. You'll find the link in the description below, or go to openaudible.org for more information. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I'm here with Benjamin Jones, Deputy Director of the Free Speech Union. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hi Josh, thanks very much.
No problem. So we live in Britain, in the United Kingdom, in possibly one of the freest societies that has ever existed. Why do we need a free speech union?
I wish we didn't, and I wish my email inbox was a little quieter, and I wish I wasn't, and the Free Speech Union weren't needed in the line of work that we're doing. Unfortunately, since we were founded in February of 2020, we've had to help literally hundreds and hundreds of people from all walks of life who have found themselves cancelled in the vernacular, forced out of their line of work, whatever it might be, or facing very serious consequences indeed for speaking their mind. Those people aren't really easily categorized. Some of them are academics, but they're really people drawn from all walks of life. It's a complete cross-section of society. So any day I might be speaking to a doctor in the NHS, I might be speaking to a cleaner, I might be speaking to a lorry driver or a teacher or a nurse. It's hugely variable. The range of their views are very incredibly varied as well. It's not people coming all from the left or the right. It's people with a wide spectrum of philosophical, religious, political, social views, who frankly probably wouldn't agree with each other about very much at all. But in the censorious climate that I'm afraid exists and has taken hold, I think probably particularly since 2016 or thereabouts, they are turning to the Free Speech Union for help because they're facing absolutely dire consequences for expressing views often that would have been completely non-controversial 5 or 6 years ago, but which have now taken on the status of being almost sacred ideas. And these people are being punished almost as blasphemers or as apostates for people who have left the left progressive side of politics, particularly over the trans debate.
So, is there any overarching theme or patterns in the sorts of people and the complaints they're making, or is it really varied?
It's really varied. There are some trends within that. So in our first year of operation, so going back to 2020, aside from everything else, that was the year of Black Lives Matter. And so what we found in our first year, we had a large thrust of our work of the people coming to us for assistance were people who had expressed a different view about how to challenge racism. We were not contacted by people who thought that racism was unproblematic. We were contacted by people who didn't want to take on a very progressive critical race theory American view of anti-racism, and who took a more liberal, perhaps a more individualistic approach to the issues of race and racism. And in the hysteria that seemed to take hold of Britain and indeed the English-speaking world in the summer of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, these issues really reach ahead, and we were inundated at that time with people who had expressed, as I say, pretty moderate, pretty liberal viewpoints about this. Since then, and I think particularly in the last year, that's been a less prominent issue in terms of the people who've been coming to us for help. And really, the preponderance in the last year has been gender critical feminists, that is to say, feminists who don't agree with trans ideology, the idea that you can change your gender. Now, once again, these people, by and large, the gender critical feminists we're speaking to, they don't have an objection to people wanting to live their life in their own way, but they're concerned about where the demands of a certain section of trans activists coincide with the rights of women and girls. And so the Free Speech Union, frankly, that's not our fight. We don't have a corporate collective view on that issue. But what we insist on is that people in all sides of that debate, with all sorts of different perspectives, can speak their minds without losing their job or being forced out of their university or whatever the consequence might be. And that hasn't been the case. And overwhelmingly, the direction of traffic has been one way. It's not been the trans right activists who have been silent. They're very able to express their views, often in extremely bellicose language. It's entirely, overwhelmingly, the gender critical feminists and their supporters who are being punished, penalised, who are afraid to speak out. So, as I say, we don't take a collective view on the issue. That's not what we're set up to do. We're set up to defend people, whatever their perspectives, and to defend their right within the law to express their views.
So, now I've had, I believe the gender critical feminists are affectionately referred to as TERFs. Which is, yeah, it was a long time before I even understood what that meant, but I just saw it thrown about the internet like one of the insults that gets thrown everywhere, you know.
I think that touches on something that has been of real interest to me, and that these debates, perhaps 3 or 4 years ago, quite recently, were very arcane, and they were a bit like, I don't know, debates among early Christians in the Byzantine Empire. They were full of completely impenetrable, almost religious language. And as I've said, these kind of sacred concepts that were completely incomprehensible to those of us who were uninitiated into these debates. But unfortunately, even if you don't take an interest in this ideology is taking an interest in you. And I remember talking to friends about this, perhaps 5 years ago, and saying, it's not really very good the way we're progressing. There does seem to be this sense of intolerance. And it was easy to think at that time, people say, well, it's just confined to universities. It's people in sociology departments going off the deep end. So what? That's been happening since the 60s. That's not news at all. Yeah. But the trouble is, it clearly isn't confined to the sociology departments or to the universities. It's spreading out into, it's now spread out into HR departments, into corporations, into the Ministry of Defence and the military. It's completely across public life and private business. So even if, a few years ago, perhaps it would have been possible to go through life without knowing any of these terms like TERF or any of these debates and being completely unfamiliar with it. Now, unfortunately, as I say, these debates do take an interest in you, and they are demanding that people comply with the set of sacred ideas that the trans right activists have been putting forward.
Yeah, it's funny you use the word sacred ideas, given that I'd say a lot of these people are probably quite critical of any sort of religion. Anyway, and I guess the key to note is that, like, none of the stuff, it's not about, like, saying that people can't hold these views. It's that, like, the issue is when their view is superior to someone else's and the other ones can't be expressed, basically. Like, short of it being, like, actual calls for violence. Yeah. But so I've had a professor, David, oh my goodness, I'm gonna forget his name, I'm gonna have to look this up, but I've had a professor on my show who was fired from Bristol University for some comments he made about the Israeli foreign policy. And actually, sorry, what were you gonna say?
Is that David Miller?
David Miller, that's it. Yeah. And actually, it wasn't even about the Israeli foreign policy. He was investigated for his comments, found to have not said anything bad, and then announced that he had been under investigation. And his announcement that he'd been under investigation was used by some students as them. Then they then complained that they felt unsafe, and then he was suspended. I believe he'll probably win his court case, but like I can. I understand what's happened there, right? With like a professor, where the students have said, okay, you know, where they're wading into complicated and very controversial issues, right? I don't think he should have been fired, but I could you give us some examples, perhaps, of say other people in careers that you wouldn't presume like speech would be an issue, even a controversial issue, you know, like you mentioned there, like nurses, I think you said,
Yeah.
or doctors, or just, I don't know, is there like silly examples where it's like careers that you think people's opinions like shouldn't even come into it that have been fired?
Yeah, certainly. I'm afraid I could probably give you too many examples to fill the whole hour.
Hmm.
I'll start with an example of a man. This is in the public domain, so I can talk about it entirely. Lots of our work, I'm afraid, is for understandable reasons confidential.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a guy called Jeremy Sleeth, and he was a trained conductor and had worked for a railway company for many years without complaint, with a good record and so on. He once, I think it was after the second lockdown had ended, he posted on his Facebook page words to the effects of, "Thank goodness the pubs are open once again. We don't want to live in an alcohol-free caliphate." I think that's almost verbatim. It was words to that effect. Words to that effect. So perhaps not language everybody would use, but you know, he was not. There's no animus in that statement towards anybody. There's no animus towards Muslims. He's simply saying he doesn't want to live in an alcohol-free caliphate. And I expect the vast majority of your listeners would agree with that sentiment. Now, he posted this on Facebook, and because of that, he lost his job. He then went through the internal sort of quasi-judicial process, which is very much like a trial, but manned entirely by sort of HR busybodies and the like. So you go through this sort of quasi-judicial process almost when you're fired from your job, or you're placed under investigation. And then after that, he was sacked, as I've said, and he was then in the position of going to an employment tribunal, and he was going to be representing himself at the tribunal, which I gather from the lawyers I know is not usually a wise course of action. Fortunately, we found Jeremy, we got in contact with him, and we were able to crowdfund to pay his legal fees and to arrange legal representation for him. So I think we raised something like £25,000, and the bulk of that we raised over the course of a Monday morning. We put it out in our newsletter to our members. So at the moment we have about 10,500 members. So it went out to our membership list, to our social media, and we raised mainly through small donations of something like 10, 15, £20, that sort of thing. We raised enough money to pay his legal fees, and then he went on to win his case. And part of the argument he made was that his belief system, secular atheism, should be protected, and that he shouldn't be discriminated against for that belief. So that was an argument that rested on, in part, on the Equality Act. So I think he's a really good example of somebody who is absolutely not a public figure. He's an ordinary member of the public in an ordinary job. He's not a high-profile academic. He's not a celebrity. And I think there is a perception from people who would criticize the Free Speech Union's work that cancel culture is a sort of confected right-wing
Yes.
well, that it's a confection to sell newspapers for the Telegraph and the Mail.
Yeah.
It's
Or from
absolutely
all the right wing comedians whose tours are called cancelled while they're selling out arenas.
yeah. So,
There's definitely a trope there that exists.
yeah. So there is this attempt to claim that we've been set up and that there isn't a real problem here. I think Jeremy Sleeth's case is exhibit A in our rebuttal, that actually there is a huge problem that is not confined to universities. I think, in fact, only about 1 in 5 of our cases concern academics or students. And that, as I've described, the process since 2016 of these ideas filtering out of universities and infecting, and I think that's probably not too strong a word, infecting public life, the private sector. You can see how cancel culture is claiming the livelihoods of people who've really not done anything wrong.
Mm.
Perhaps they've used a clumsy form of words, perhaps they've used a form of words that most people wouldn't use, but very often they've just expressed their own views in pretty temperate language,
Mm.
and their views are pretty non-controversial, but they still fall foul of this set of sacred ideas. So I think he's a really good example. I mean, I can give you
Yeah, well, just
dozens
briefly,
of others.
what was the reasoning given for like firing him? Like, did they say specifically like we find this comment to be some like racist, Islamophobic, like I don't know, anti-lockdown? like what was the reason given?
The thing we see in cases like this is there are a set of policies that you sign up to when you're employed, and there will be things like an equality policy, a dignity and respect policy. There'll be a social media policy, almost certainly. And one of the clauses in a contract that usually catches people out, or which can catch people out, is a prohibition on bringing your employer into disrepute. Now, that can mean almost anything. And I think we've sleepwalked into a situation effectively where you can have freedom of speech if you're retired or if you're
Mm.
fantastically wealthy and you don't need to worry about paying your rent or your mortgage. But if you're employed, you only have freedom of speech subject to the approval of your employer and subject to you not saying anything that brings your employer into what they decide is disreputable.
Mm.
And so Jeremy Sleeth's employer could say, well, that comment brings us into disrepute. And he signed a contract which stipulates that. And so I think we have reached a really awful position where basically if you're wealthy, you're fine. You can say what you like within the law. But for those of us who are employed, it's really very, very difficult. And so I think, if you forgive my saying, that's one of the aspects of work that I'm proudest of, that
Mm.
we're helping people. It's not just the household names or the J.K. Rowlings and Kathleen Stocks. It is people like Jeremy Sleeth.
Mm. Yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned academics and students. Like,
Yeah.
what's happening with students that they're getting? Like, what are they getting expelled from the universities?
I think the most ludicrous case I've seen, and this is saying something, was the case of Lisa Keogh at Abertay University. This was about a year and a half ago now, I think. And she, in the course of a seminar, she was a law student. She was a final year law student, I think just a few months away from finishing her degree. And she had expressed the not especially controversial view that only women have vaginas.
Okay,
And for
right.
that, I mean, you have to laugh because it's ludicrous that that would become a matter of controversy. But for that, she was placed
Isn't
under.
that why people get like surgery?
Well,
Like, isn't that the point?
she, well, you might think. I mean, I know,
Like, you know what I
yeah,
mean? Though?
absolutely ludicrous. But unfortunately, what happened next is not funny in the slightest. Because she was placed under investigation. She was a mature student, I think. Well, in her late 20s, I think, and she had children. So she had a lot of stress. She had her final year law exams, and she had children to think about. And then she was placed under investigation right at the tail end of her degree for this completely innocuous comment. So I think her case is such a good demonstration of what students can be up against. And even though she's eventually cleared the investigation, it takes a very long time for that process to happen,
Mm.
during which she's under a huge amount of stress and is distracted from her exams and so on. And this is not an original observation, but the process is the punishment in cases like that. And so you have her case, she might win ultimately, and she did. And we spent a lot of time assisting her with that. But I think you have to then consider the chilling effect that that has on everybody else who was in that seminar who
Mm.
might have agreed with her.
Yeah.
And one of the things we see quite frequently now, and I was speaking to some academics about this, in fact, on Tuesday, is about the position of, well, generally it's young women, perhaps first year students, who have gender critical views, and their fear about expressing these opinions at all. I mean, we've reached a point where students are having to be smuggled into lectures by gender critical speakers because they don't want their peers to notice them going in, and they don't want to be perceived as
Really?
supporting. Yeah, yeah.
Is that actually
This
true?
happened. This happened recently at Cambridge. So it,
I mean,
it
Cambridge have gone a bit off the cliff edge, man. Like, no,
yeah.
I saw an article that they're planning to teach gender neutral German, and I was like, what? Like, as someone who can speak German, at least, well, at least an Austrian dialect version of German, but German, that's the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, and the trouble is the monoculture now is such that pushing back against these things requires. I mean, I don't think it's overstating to say it requires personal courage, because you can find yourself in a situation where you're ostracized by your peers,
Hmm.
which is difficult for anybody, I think, whatever your age. But it's particularly difficult for a teenager who's just arrived at university and wants to make friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, and teenagers, despite the stereotype, are actually, I think, incredibly conformist. And it's very difficult to go against the grain at any age, but particularly for young students.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't want to be too pessimistic, but unfortunately, there is a clear generational component to this. So I finished my undergraduate degree 10 years ago in 2012, and it was a completely different climate. And I had
Yeah. I'd have been
the
fucked.
yeah, and it was the kind of small L liberal, in the classical sense, education
Hmm.
that had been provided for decades, centuries, you might say. And so I had a process of university education that was fundamentally like the one that my parents' generation would have had. And then you fast forward just 4 or 5, 6 years hence,
Yeah.
and you can see that that is not what students are getting now. And the polling is pretty dire actually on what students think about freedom of speech. Um, and interestingly, there's quite a big sex divide. There does seem to be quite a significant component of young women who are more hostile to free speech. But on the flip side of that, and I wouldn't want to generalize, on the flip side of that, there are some very courageous, as I've just said,
Mm-hmm.
young women at universities who are really pushing back against gender ideology, and who are very forthright in expressing their views despite the huge difficulties that entails. So I do think there's hope. I don't think it's right for people to despair. And I think the climate at universities can be turned around, but it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of boring work. It takes a lot of work of going through committees, of making sure HR policies aren't censorious. Um, and it takes a lot of time and energy. And I think the pro free speech side have to have more energy and a stronger will to resist this cancel culture and the censorship that exists on campus and in workplaces, than our opponents do. And I'd say again, whatever your view on the trans debate, that does seem to be where most of our troubles are coming from with respect to free speech at the moment. But
Mm.
whatever your views on that, I think people on campus and elsewhere need to be able to talk openly about it, and it's just not happening at the moment, or it's very difficult. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what tends to happen as well, paradoxically, is in an attempt to ensure that an ideology prevails by shutting someone else down in any sense or in any case, what tends to happen is that you you make the opponents stronger by making martyrs out of them. Like, if they hadn't, like, it's almost as if they would have more chance of winning the argument if they hadn't tried to shut people down. And I think that happens in a lot of cases. There's this weird thing, like, where the more you attempt to censor something, like this it's basically the Streisand effect on the internet, you know, where the more you try and shut something down, the more it will rear its ugly head. Um, it's
I
like
think
that's
that's
yeah. Sorry.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think Kathleen Stock is a good example. So she was the academic at Sussex University who was effectively handed out of a job. Um, and she was not a household name. She was a well-respected academic in her field. But her fame and her influence has increased dramatically since this attempt to ruin her life, to ruin her career. So although it had the effect of effectively forcing her out of her job, um, it has hugely increased her profile. And likewise, with the Free Speech Union, there was an attempt by PayPal earlier this year, just a couple of months ago, to close our account to stop us using their services because, well, it's not entirely clear why, because they didn't like something about what we were doing in sticking up for people. And because of that, that attracted such a huge backlash. Thousands and thousands of people wrote showing us that they cancelled their PayPal accounts in response. Our membership dramatically increased. Members of Parliament, I can't remember how many, I think 40 or 50 MPs, including a former leader of the Conservative Party, signed a letter to the government asking for action to be taken on this. The business secretary at the time condemned it. And so I think, as you say, that's a classic Streisand effect, where the Free Speech Union, there's an attempt to shut us down by PayPal, and it's completely backfired. So if you're strong enough and well connected enough to survive an attempt like that, or if we can help you survive an attempt like that, it can completely backfire. But what I'd also say is that lots of people aren't in a position where they have access to a high profile and to journalists, and they're not able to make clear and expose what's happening to them. And so in those cases, I think it's tremendously difficult to fight back. And so I think that's what the Free Speech Union can offer is a unique service where we are helping people in situations like that all the time. And I think going back to one of your very first questions, I wish we didn't have to exist. I wish we didn't have to be doing this kind of work. But unfortunately, at the moment, there is a huge demand for it.
Well, I guess freedom and democracy comes with the responsibility to have to endlessly defend it. You can't just build a system and then have it be perfect. It's always going to degrade, I think. But thankfully, we have people like yourselves. So let's talk a little bit more about this PayPal thing.
Yes.
So, like, what? Yeah. Do you want to just explain to people what happened, and then we can go a little deeper?
So, for those who don't know, the Free Speech Union was founded by the journalist and writer Toby Young, and Toby had an email on the 15th of September, completely out of the blue, informing him that PayPal were initiating closure of the Free Speech Union's account. They also closed his personal account, and they closed the account of another organisation he founded called Daily Skeptic. This was with absolutely no warning whatsoever. No real justification was ever provided to us, except that he, and by extension the Free Speech Union, had breached the acceptable use policy that PayPal has in place. So to give some kind of sense of the impact this has, I think about a third of our members paid their monthly or annual subscriptions via PayPal. So, I mean, imagine if you're running a small business and a third of your income is suddenly lost. So that was the pretty cataclysmic situation we were faced with. As I've just described a moment ago, in response to that, we were able to mobilise a pretty huge backlash against PayPal, and it received very widespread condemnation. And the accounts ultimately were restored. And part of the backlash was on social media, and thousands of people, as I said a moment ago, had cancelled their accounts with PayPal. And I think in the sort of the weeks where this was going on, they lost something like $20 billion off their market value. So
really, 20 billion.
It's a lot of money. And they had to backtrack in the end. And one of the other components of this backlash against PayPal was that they had announced an update to their acceptable use policy, which essentially gave PayPal the right to fine their customers $2,500 and shut down their accounts if they promoted misinformation.
Mm-hmm. You see, I've just been doing some Googling, and Snopes is saying that they didn't do that. Even though, like, it's absolutely amazing what happened with this thing. Like, the machine jumped to the defense of PayPal like you wouldn't believe. Like I saw the things, I read the bit in the terms of service. I know you're telling the truth here, right?
Yeah.
And yet, like, I'm just pulling up these articles for people here to show them. Like, It's the Snopes one is no, PayPal isn't planning to fine users $2,500 for misinformation. MSN, no, PayPal won't fine people for spreading misinformation. It's like, yes, that's exactly what they said they were going to do. Like, and it's insane.
And the problem is, I mean, so our response to this is basically, and I should say as well, we have had a lot of contacts from people since who have had their accounts suspended either by PayPal or by companies that use PayPal or indeed other financial service providers um, for expressing their views. And again, that often tends to be gender critical feminists as well, or people expressing their views on that issue. So there's been a spate of this stuff going on. The Free Speech Union, what happened to us, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. Lots of kind of small content creators have had their accounts shut down, and it has obviously has a really damaging effect, and can completely cut your business off at the knees. So it's very frightening. So we're of the view that companies should not be able to discriminate on these political grounds when they're providing financial services. I mean, there is a counter argument to that. There'd be people of a libertarian perspective who'd say, well, okay, I don't like that it's happened and I wouldn't make that decision, but it's a private business, so it should be allowed to do whatever it wants. Now, the issue there is that for a company like PayPal, for these financial service providers, they are monopolies. Mm-hmm. And they are not just a business within the marketplace. They are now absolutely integral to making the market function. So I think, to my way of thinking, they are of a different category. They are not merely private businesses. They have become absolutely fundamental to the way our economy operates now. And we cannot have a situation, I think, where people, be it the Free Speech Union and content creators or ordinary punters, can have their accounts closed by their bank or by their financial service provider or by PayPal or by whoever it is. So I think this really, I think, should be of concern to everybody listening, because you might think, well, I'm never going to be engaged in promoting misinformation. I'm never going to be engaged in kind of content creation or whatever. But do we really want a situation where your accounts can be closed because PayPal don't like your political views or they disagree with your religious or philosophical beliefs? In the latter case, I think we clearly accept that's discrimination already. But I think it's a very, very, very dangerous territory that we're approaching with these issues. So we're very active now in pushing back against this. And what is heartening about the whole episode is that the backlash against PayPal has shown that there is a real cost to companies behaving like this. So that's promising, I think. But there's a lot of work to be done, and we wrote a report recently that just came out a couple of weeks ago, essentially auditing various financial services, so Patreon, Ko-fi, GoFundMe, and so on, to assess their terms and conditions. And what we found is really very startling. And the majority of the companies that we looked at, and this report's on our website. It's quite short, so you can go.
What's it called? I'm just going to pull it up here.
Yeah, so if you go to the Free Speech Union website, it's called How Free Speech Friendly Are the Major Payment Processors and Crowdfunding Platforms. And so that came out this month. And when you go through that, you can see that we have gone through basically the biggest examples of these companies and gone through all of their terms and conditions. And the majority of them have incredibly subjective language about how their platforms can be used or what kind of content you can put out while using these platforms. So only Stripe and WorldPay were unproblematic, if I can use that word. And the rest we looked at were really pretty seriously concerning. And so, as I said, I think this is of real concern to everybody, or it should be. And I think this is a major front now in the free speech, cancel culture wars. It's really very troubling. I think it's probably among the most sinister forms of cancel culture I've seen in my time at the Free Speech Union, certainly.
Yeah, it's... Sorry, I was just trying to find it there. I have it here, full briefing. So... Yeah, you go through what? PayPal, WorldPay, Stripe. Pretty sure Stripe was founded by a person from Northern Ireland. Woo. Let's cheer my fucking home country. Amazon Pay, Shopify, Revolut, like, and the insidious thing for me about this sort of, oh, if you say the wrong thing, you can't use our service to use your own money,
Yeah.
is like a really disturbing, what seems a front runner to the sort of central bank digital currencies slash social credit score that our glorious leaders seem to love to praise and attempt to emulate. Yeah, and it's like, I don't really agree. I don't agree with the stuff that Kanye was saying recently. However, he made the very salient point that all he did was say the wrong thing, and he wasn't. His Apple Pay was turned off. Like, he said the wrong thing, and he had no access to the money that was his. Which is, it's like, you think your money is yours, like you've earned it, you've gone out and fucking earned it, and you say it with malice or not, like the wrong thing, and you can have your no access to like things that are essential to life, and that disturbs me so much, man. What disturbs me more is the sort of acceptance of that seems like it doesn't feel like there's a big pushback against that idea. It's like, oh well, you shouldn't have said it then, and it's like, yeah, okay, but wait till it happens to you.
I think what happened to Free Speech Union was a bit of a wake up call to people, and we were pretty pleased with the political backlash to it. And a lot of members of parliament were really very concerned about, I think, for exactly the reason you've just described, about what this decision suggests about the way our economy is going to function in the future. I mean, the social credit system is an obvious and unnerving comparison to make, but I think there's one key difference in that in a authoritarian regime, be it China or Russia or whatever, you know what you can't say. But in the West at the moment, particularly in the Anglosphere West, you can say something 2 years ago and it's fine, nobody bats an eyelid. And then suddenly it's found to violate one of these sacred ideas, and you can lose your job, or PayPal can close your account or whatever. And so I think that's again one of the really troubling aspects of the mess the West seems to have found itself in at the moment, where our social mores are changing so quickly, that people cannot possibly keep up or be expected to keep up.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're not on Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, sometimes I find myself explaining to, particularly to my parents' generation, of trying to explain some case or some situation that's gone on in the news. And if you're not on social media regularly and you're not on Twitter, it's absolutely incomprehensible. I mean, the case I cited earlier of Lisa Keogh at Abertay University,
Mm-hmm.
that is incomprehensible. If you've not spent the last 5 years learning about what trans rights activists believe and about transgender ideology and all the rest of it, that is a completely incomprehensible situation. You cannot understand it.
Yeah, I've had this discussions about it with older relatives and family friends, or just like vaguely, I'll be talking about something, be like, oh yeah, did you see this person got banned or something, or that, they've seen some headlines about J.K. Rowling in
Yeah,
the press, and they're like, oh well, she must have said something awful, and I'm like, no, she expressed something that to a lot of people seems very reasonable, and has been shredded for it, like shredded. I can't, I don't like. Before I really went and looked at it, I thought she'd said something really abhorrent. I thought she must have said something really vile and disgusting.
yeah,
And it turns out what she said was, I don't think trans women are the same as women who were born as women. Or, that's paraphrasing, but that was the essentially what she said. And that was enough for people to call her a bigot and a transphobe, and like disown her from her entire body of work that's brought so much joy to millions. It's incredible.
it is. And the vitriol and intimidation that J.K. Rowling and her supporters attract, and we've had people who've been sacked for saying J.K. Rowling has the right to say what she said.
Wait,
That's how
just for not even for agreeing with what she said, just for saying that she has the right,
that's how
and
sinister
they were
it becomes.
fired.
Yeah,
Like actually, they lost their job because of
they,
that.
they lost job, lost work from it. Yeah.
Like,
So
like
that's
what was this? Just because of that thing that you said earlier about the policies that people sign when they start a job.
in part, and to some extent, you can understand if you're running a business, you don't want your employees bringing you into disrepute by saying something horrendously racist or something that most people would find utterly appalling or that
Mm-hmm.
your customers would find completely abhorrent. So
Mm-hmm.
you can see some sense in a provision like that, but it's so subjective that it can be interpreted so broadly, um, as to place an employee completely at the sort of capricious whims of their employer in terms of whether they're allowed to articulate their opinions or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so, exactly as I said, merely for defending the right of people to express these views. And this comes back, in fact, as well to the PayPal case, with the Free Speech Union, where, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, we're not engaged in articulating a view about the gender debate or any of these other issues where our members have found themselves in trouble. All we're saying is that people should be able to express their opinions without being censored. And still, because we're merely defending the right of people to do that, we had our account taken down.
It's completely baffling that like where you mentioned 2016
Yeah.
as somewhat of a turning point for this. Well, like, what do you think it was that has created this society that seems so trigger happy with saying someone can never speak again? Like I saw someone make this fantastic. I think it was Tim Pool, and they were talking about the sort of ongoing debate on Twitter about who gets their account back, basically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And they were laughing because they said you can murder four people in the street and you can get out of jail, but but if you've said something that like the Twitter sphere deemed to be, or the previous Twitter administration deemed to be wrong,
Yeah.
you might never get your ability to have a Twitter account back. Like Alex Berenson, who's successfully won his court case against Twitter, and got put back on the platform, but he was stating things that, like, the reason he got banned was for stating something that now is widely accepted to be completely accurate, and he may have had his right to use Twitter removed forever for that, and yet yeah, someone who yeah murdered four people on the street has more chance for redemption. Obviously,
Um,
slightly different circumstances, but
the problem is, again, a bit like what I've said about how PayPal is now so integral to the way our economy functions. Whether you like it or not, and whether you use it or not, Twitter is an essential part of the public square. I mean, for better or worse. I mean, I think there's a good argument for saying it's had a horrendous consequence on a horrendous effect on the quality of public debate, in Britain and America elsewhere.
yeah.
But nonetheless, it is where a huge amount of our public debate and discussion now takes place, and so it has become something much more than just another private company. To answer the first bit of your question about
Yeah.
why 2016 and where it's come from, um, I think that the immediate triggers in part are political. They're Donald Trump, they're Jeremy Corbyn, and
Hmm.
so on. And so there is this
Yeah.
populism on the left and the right, and so on. I think that will not be news to anybody listening to this. But I think the deeper roots go back further than that. I mean, you could probably say all the way back to the Reformation if you wanted to, but I'm quite persuaded, and this is not my original argument by any measure, but I'm quite persuaded by the idea that the collapse of religious belief has has created a vacuum, which is now being filled by this successor ideology, what people in the vernacular are called woke, this sort of
Mm.
authoritarian progressivism, um, and that it has hijacked latent Christian impulses, particularly ideas around victimhood. And in a way, it's almost like the perfect virus to infect uh, the host body of the West because we're so susceptible as a society to these ideas about the obligations of the strong to defend the weak, and so on. And so I think lots of the authoritarian progressive ideology is it's certainly post-Christian. I mean, I think that's the reason why this is happening in the Anglosphere West. It's not happening in India. It's not happening in Japan, and I think it is filling a void that's been left by the collapse of Christianity. And I think lots of the energy that people would want to put into religion, they're now looking to invest in politics. They're looking for politics to provide the kind of fulfillment that once would have been provided by religion. I don't know what the answer to any of that is, but I hope that's a vaguely interesting answer to your question. I mean, I think that's probably where it comes from, ultimately.
Yeah. You're far from the first person to suggest that to me.
Yeah.
And I'm becoming increasingly convinced that that's at least part of what's going on.
Yeah.
Because I think, yeah, I mean, people will worship something. Like I think the idea behind the book and TV show, actually, American Gods by Neil Gaiman. I think there's something very real to be said about that, about the new gods, or, you know, technology and television, phones, our political religion, or our sport. You know, it's just humans want to deify something, whether that's you know, Jeremy Corbyn or Donald Trump or whatever political commentator they think is the greatest person on the planet, whether that's Joe Rogan or Ibram X Kendi or, you know, any of these people with huge reaches.
So again, I mean, I'd say you can be as woke as you like. There's no skin off my nose whatsoever. You can be as progressive as you want to be. That's absolutely fine. You can go into the public square, make your arguments. You can win people around. You can win elections. You can change public policy. You can make your case in Parliament. You can go on TV. These are all the established means in a democratic society by which these things are done. So I don't have an objection to people being progressive in their politics or arguing for progressive causes. What I do object to is authoritarian progressivism, just as I would argue against authoritarian conservatism. And if we were having this conversation in the United States in the 1950s, we'd be talking about, you know, our casework would be helping people who'd been blacklisted in Hollywood because they were accused of being communists. So I'd make exactly the same principled argument to you. So you can be as woke as you want to be. That's not the problem. The problem is when your HR department of work is sending you around lists of anti-racist authors and saying this is effectively now the company policy towards race, because that goes beyond a policy. That goes to beyond mandating a philosophical view. And I fundamentally don't think that an employee should be required to endorse the philosophical views of their employer. Of course, there are exceptions to that. If you work for the Labour Party, it's not unreasonable to say you have to agree with our political and ideological stuff. So, of course,
that varied quite significantly depending on which year you're talking about.
Yeah, of course. But so, there are, of course, exceptions to that. But in general, for most employees, for most employers and businesses, I think that's the case, that you should not be required to parrot the philosophical views of your employer. And I think also there's a strong case of saying that sections of society, large sections of society, should be non-political, that politics shouldn't generally be brought into the workplace. But unfortunately, that is what is happening. It's not always top down. Often it's a certain cohort, generally, I'm afraid, of younger employees coming in, and you see this a lot in publishing, where they are trying to drive a certain progressive ideology through. And again, that's not in itself necessarily objectionable, but it's when they say, okay, well, we're not going to work on books published by gender critical feminists or by conservatives because we don't agree with them. So when you've got a situation where publishing staff are saying that, we've really lost the plot.
Well, I like to hope that then better publishers will pop up, and that the whole, I think that the go woke go broke thing is not because of the ideas that they hold, it's because of their demand to not have any other ideas. It's
Exactly.
like, I think what you've said is puts it perfectly, that we need to have. It's fine. Go believe whatever mad shit you want. I don't care if you believe that interdimensional aliens were the source of the January 6th storming of Congress. I don't care if you think that no gender has ever existed and people are all just neutral, malleable automatons of
But don't
nothing.
require me to believe it.
Yeah, but
That's,
like,
that's all we're saying.
just it's for me. It's always like, if you want to censor someone, I think you've already lost the argument, because all it betrays is the idea that you're so terrified that your point of view might be bad or wrong
Yeah.
that you don't want it challenged, because you can't back it up. If you can't stand up, if your ideas can't stand up to criticism, then they're not very good ideas, and then you might have to face the fact that maybe what you think isn't particularly, yeah, fantastic. But yeah, just before we go and sort of wrap up here, I did want to talk about one more thing,
Yeah.
which was the online safety bill, because I think disturbingly it's not getting a lot of coverage, and it's basically a step down the road whereby the government is going to have some sort of say in what is allowed to be said on the internet, which seems like essentially the very antithesis of what the internet is meant to be. Do you believe that they can succeed in regulating this?
So the legislation started in part wanting to stop young teenagers from being exposed to horrendous content online,
Mm-hmm.
pro-suicide content, that sort of thing. I can't really see that anybody would object to that.
No.
Unfortunately, it started from that premise and has grown exponentially to encompass all manner of online activity and online harms, quote unquote, to the extent that the most recent draft of the legislation would have mandated that social media companies remove legal but harmful content. And I mean, that expression is so utterly devoid of sense and is so menacing towards free speech, it really can't be overstated. So, legal but harmful content would be banned online.
Oh,
And
just to point out, actually, I believe that that clause has actually been dropped from it.
it has. And what I was going to go on to say, so this is the first, or not the first, but the earlier draft of the legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So that has been dropped. We have been led to believe. But the original legislation would have meant that the Secretary of State for Culture would have been able to designate what counted as harmful. So Parliament would pass this legislation, and the Secretary of State would be able to say, well, X, Y, and Z, those types of material are harmful. So social media companies, you have to remove it. So it was as authoritarian towards freedom of speech online as it was possible to be. So, as you said, the legal but harmful has been dropped, we think. And we're having this conversation on the 24th of November, and it's just been announced a couple of hours ago that the revised legislation will be before Parliament again, I think on the 5th of December. So we're really now just waiting to see if the legal but harmful language has been completely removed, as has been suggested it will be, and see what the new legislation will look like. But the other aspects of it that we're particularly concerned by is under clause 52. And this is a clause which specifies that if content is illegal in any one part of the UK, so if something is illegal to say or post online in Scotland, social media companies should remove it all across the UK. So in other words, Nicola Sturgeon can decide that, say, gender critical speech online is harmful, to give a speculative example. And then if you're posting that in England or Wales or Northern Ireland, you can find that your post is taken down, that your account is suspended, because social media companies are compelled to remove it because it's illegal to say in Scotland. So this is a huge danger in the legislation as well. So as I say, we're going to see what comes back before Parliament on the 5th of December, and we'll have to see what it looks like. The original aim of the bill was pretty non-controversial, but it has waded into territory which is as I said, it can't be overstated, the menace that it poses to freedom of speech online. So we'll see what comes back on the 5th of December, and hopefully it will be a dramatically revised piece of legislation that sticks to its original purpose.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so too. What's also shocking that I want to pull up for people here is that, so according to the Spectator, I'm gonna believe that they've got their facts right here. Um, says this duty, in terms of the legal but harmful duties, was also going to apply to encrypted messaging platforms like WhatsApp and iMessage, which is like, whoa. So they're the idea is that they could just you could you you couldn't say, like, even if the point is like you don't want people to be exposed to, like, you don't want the wrong people to be quote unquote platformed because it gives them like a wide, like a loudspeaker to talk to a lot of people. Um, but as well as that, that you could text someone the wrong thing as a joke,
Yeah.
probably, because like who the fuck is this? There's not gonna be humans reading the entire message or messaging thread, and then on top of that, it's like who the so right so that just all of our encrypted messages are going to be read now. Is that what they're saying?
I mean, the direction of travel. I mean, this was. I think it was 2020. There was a piece of legislation passed in Scotland. One of the many problems with it, it was a piece of hate crime legislation. One of the many problems with it, as it was being drafted, was it removed the private dwelling defence, i.e., you can say something in your own home that you would not be at liberty to shout in a public square or to post online or whatever. So I think you can see the issue of WhatsApp that you just raised in a similar light, where this idea of what you can say privately is also being eroded and is also being placed under attack. I think I make one more general point about the legislation is that MPs get a lot of abuse on social media. If you're a member of Parliament, Twitter must just be an absolute cesspit. So
Probably, yeah.
and for the staff, the MP staff looking through all of that every day and the abuse message and all the rest of it, I get that that's not going to be much fun. And lots of it goes beyond not being much fun and is threatening, and there are death threats and so on. So I think it's pretty non-controversial to say that sort of thing.
Mm.
Nobody wants to see that. But I think the issue is that gives MPs probably such a distorted perspective of what most social media is like,
Mm.
that in a way they're the worst people to be making these types of decisions,
Yes.
because their perspective is not the perspective of an ordinary social media user. So I think that's also a problem that if I was speaking to a member of parliament, I'd put that point to them and urge them to bear in mind that there is a duty to uphold freedom of speech for their constituents, even if they are bearing the brunt of some pretty horrible stuff on social media.
Mm. Had not thought of it like that, actually. That's a very good point. I'm sure. Although, as well, when you talk about death threats, they should be banned. It's like, I don't believe in banning people for many things, but calls to violence and threatening people seems like the thing that, like that plus doxing, those seem like the two things that seem very reasonable to ban someone for, you know?
Yeah. I mean, just one example to illustrate the point was after the murder of Sir David Amess, there by an Islamist, there was this frenzied debate in the days afterwards about banning online anonymity on social media. Now, to my knowledge, there's been no demonstration, no proof that the man who stabbed him, the murderer, had targeted him online in any way. I mean, perhaps he had, but I've not seen any evidence of that report so far. So there was this very strange kind of misdirection. Firstly, not wanting to talk about the issue of how to tackle, which is a much overused word, to tackle Islamist ideology in Britain. And instead, there was this distraction, this funneling of energy and attention into online anonymity. And for lots of people, for example, for ex-Muslims, online anonymity is absolutely vital to them being able to express their views, because they will find themselves under attack either figuratively or very literally for expressing their opinions. So I think, again, unfortunately, that is another example in utterly dreadful circumstances of where MPs are not thinking perhaps about the issue of social media regulation in a way that most people would like them to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, Benjamin, it's been great chatting to you. It's been a lot of fun. Do you want to point people towards anything? Links for Free Speech Union and everything we've discussed will be in the description below. But is there anything else you'd like to direct people to?
Well, if I give a quick plug, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Membership starts at £2.49 a month for students, and I think it's just £4.99 a month for everybody else. So join up, and our case and legal teams are helping people every day, as I said, from all walks of life who need our assistance. And pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much.
No problem. Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.